Welcome to episode 1 of the C Word, a show where we ask important questions like just what the is wrong with capitalism? And today we're going back in time to the year 1991. What a time it was. As I say, there was a lot going on. Unlike the parliamentary R.LUM.R, we're living under these days. It was a time of immense political instability. After Rajiv Gandhi's term ended in 1989, we had 3 different prime ministers in a span of 2 years. It was quite a dangerous time being a prime minister at all in these years, considering 2 had been assassinated in the last 7 years.
नागरिक भी स्वागत करने के लिए रथ के लिए खड़े होंगे और इसीलिए मैं एक बार आपसे निवेदन करूंगा कि मेरे साथ प्रेम से जोर से कहिए सियावर रामचंद्र की और दूसरा कहिए जहां राम का जन्म हुआ था मंदिर वहीं बनाएंगे जहां राम का जन्म हुआ था मंदिर वहीं बनाएंगे बहुत बहुत
Meanwhile, noted temple enthusiast and Amit Shah version 1.0 L.K. Advani had recently finished driving around the country in a Toyota pretending it was a Rath to get everybody riled up about some mosque in Ayodhya, leaving behind a trail of violence from other similarly disgruntled temple fans. Adding to the turmoil in the country, VP Singh's National Front government had just tried to implement the recommendations of the Mandal Commission to reserve government jobs for socially and economically backward classes. It faced fierce protests, and when the BJP withdrew its support to the government, VP Singh himself was left without a government job. I am pretty sure he does not appreciate the irony in that. Oh, and the Indian economy faced its worst ever crisis, and it changed everything. So, who is to blame for the dire straits the Indian economy found itself in by the middle of the year 1991? Well, there is a familiar story we've all heard, or at least some version of it, and it goes something like this. Since independence, India had been ruled by the evil communist Nehru-Gandhi family, who gave us our own version of the Soviet leadership. First, we had Jawaharlal Lenin Nehru, the guy who created this entire mess but died before it really went to shit. Then there was Indira Stalin Gandhi, the nasty one who liked locking people up in gulags and fighting wars. Pulling strings from behind the scenes, we had Sanjay Beria Gandhi. And finally, there was the revisionist sellout, Rajiv Gorbachev Gandhi. And the Nehru-Gandhi rule, it was awful, like a never-ending journey into the heart of darkness. It was the socialist dark age, the long night of license Raj, import substitutions, a dominant public sector, capital controls, bank nationalizations. Oh, the horror. And finally, in 1991, the socialist chickens came home to roost. Current account deficits soared, foreign reserves dwindled, India had to ship a shit ton of gold to the Bank of England as security for loans. In a 2004 paper, former chief economic advisor and wealthy dad from a Karan Johar movie, Arvind Subramanian, along with a colleague, described this tale of decades-long economic malpractice very succinctly. The conventional story about India, which can be glimpsed in any number of policy-oriented papers and newspaper articles, goes like this. Until 1991, India's policymakers followed misguided policies that closed the economy to international trade, erected inefficient industries under state guidance, riddled the private sector with extraordinarily cumbersome and detailed regulations, and suffocated private economic activity with controls and bureaucratic impediments. Then, in 1991, the big breakthrough occurred. And the breakthrough occurred, so the story goes, when good old Mohan Singh flicked a switch and made the economy go from socialism to capitalism. In doing so, he not only saved the economy but set us on the path for high growth and economic prosperity, reliant not on state intervention but on market forces. And things have been going pretty great since then, right? Right? The thing is, I don't find myself agreeing with Arvind Subramanian a lot, but I'm willing to make an exception in this case, as in the paper, he and his colleague refer to this conventional story as a caricature. If that is the case, I suppose we need a better story. Alright, so do we have a better story about what really happened in 1991? Well, yes, we do, and I can describe it to you in two words: structural adjustment. Now, if you haven't heard this phrase before, let me just warn you, whatever you think it is, it's much, much worse. Allow me to explain with an analogy. So, you've heard of gunboat diplomacy, right? The big bad colonial power parks its fleet right next to a coastal city or some weaker country, and the threat of force is usually enough to ensure instant capitulation. The British famously did it to China during the First Opium War. The big baddie is able to impose its will on the little guy with virtually no effort. Now, structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, are kind of like that in that they subjugate entire nations without outright force and bloodshed. The difference being that instead of the threat of the cannon, the big baddies in the case of SAPs thrive on the threat of economic collapse. What follows is a silent coup of sorts, where the country under threat is forced to abandon its autonomy to save itself from ruin. This was basically what the World Bank and the IMF did to 70 developing countries between 1980 and 1993. Let's say a country is going through an economic crisis, whatever the reason, and you can't get new loans because your credit is short, because nobody is certain you'll be able to pay it back. In walks the World Bank and the IMF in their shiny suits and lizard tails, and they dangle a big fat dollar check in front of your face. You can have their money, they say, as much as you want. And because you don't want your country to descend into chaos, you nod and say yes. And then they tell you what's going to happen next. You're going to take their money and then you're going to do exactly what they want you to do. Understood? And you nod again. Nod and nod and nod like the obedient neo-imperial subject you are, you silly oriental buffoon. How stupid were we to think you natives could run the country by yourself? Look what a mess you've made of the economy, you imbecile. We should have never left. And from now on, you listen to us and do what we say, no questions asked. And what do the bank and the IMF want? Writer Asad Izmi describes the SAP prescription in his paper, Impoverishing a Continent, as follows. The World Bank's SAPs, first instituted in 1980, enforced privatization of industries, including necessities such as healthcare and water, cuts in government spending and imposition of user fees, liberalizing of capital markets, which leads to unstable trading in currencies, market-based pricing, which tends to raise the cost of basic goods, higher interest rates, and trade liberalization. SAPs evolved to cover more and more areas of domestic policy, not only fiscal, monetary, and trade policy, but also labor laws, healthcare, environmental regulations, civil service requirements, energy policy, and government procurement. Any of that sound familiar to you? This has pretty much been India's macroeconomic framework since 1991. Though we can be sure that the bank and the IMF are not too happy due to the fact that popular resistance has restricted the Indian government's ability to execute certain parts of their agenda. But they mostly get what they want. And they did get what they wanted in 1991. The socialist but not so socialist dark age did indeed end. And what came next was the glorious dawn of the free market, sponsored by the World Bank and the IMF. Now, I guess some of you are thinking that all this stuff I just told you about SAPs and IMF and World Bank, it's not really a new story at all. It's actually a really, really old one.
Postmodern neo-Marxists
Cannot admit that our lousy system cannot and did not work, and that it brought us to the brink of collapse. But well, our precious ideology cannot handle reality, so hey, let's blame the IMF or the good people at the World Bank who actually rescued us in our time of need. Which they wouldn't have had to had we just admitted that socialism doesn't work.
Postmodern neo-Marxists
They're always crying about being victims, and instead of lifting ourselves up by our bootstraps, we have the gall to blame evil white people for all our problems. Okay, so a couple of responses if you find yourself in agreement with that line of thinking. First of all, blaming socialism for the 1991 crisis is kind of meaningless because India wasn't a socialist economy before that, and what it was, we'll get to in a bit. And secondly, I agree that painting the 1991 moment as simply bad white capitalists bully poor underdeveloped India into submission is extremely reductive. The IMF and the World Bank offered an out for the Indian ruling class, but what got us there were the inherent contradictions of the established order. Now, I know this might be hard for some to believe, but India was not a socialist country prior to 1991, nor has it ever been one since independence. I know it's weird, after all, it's in the preamble to the constitution, right? But guess what? Governments lie. That's what they do. Anyway, if it wasn't socialism, then what was it? And here I finally have some good news because I have a fancy new French word to teach you which you can pull out of the bag to impress your friends or co-workers. And the word is dirigeism, which comes from the verb diriger, meaning to direct. Essentially, a dirigist state plays a huge role in determining the direction the economy will take. Dirigist regimes are big on economic planning, state-directed investment, control of key industries, etc. And that's what we had in India to varying degrees from independence until 1991. And certainly the vestiges of that regime continue to exist to this day. Dirigist regimes can be contrasted with others where the state plays a more regulatory role, while the heavy lifting in the economy is left to the private sector and market forces. What is of importance to us is that dirigist regimes, even though they are quite different from pure free market capitalism, are nevertheless a kind of capitalist system based on private property, wage labor, profit motive, and the like. And like all capitalist systems, there are certain internal contradictions that push it towards instability and crises. In a paper from 1995, economists Prabhat Patnaik and C.P. Chandrasekhar lay out three major contradictions of the Indian dirigist regime that will help to explain the 1991 crisis. The first one is that there was a fundamental conflict between the Indian state's developmental role and its class role. Patnaik and Chandrasekhar posit that in a dirigist regime, the state is the prime mover of economic dynamism. That is, for the economy to grow, state expenditure has to keep on growing. Why? Because that was a key element in keeping demand up. The authors explain that due to the lack of aggressive land redistribution in post-independence India, the market for factory-produced consumption goods was limited to relatively few people. The improvements in agriculture also accrued to a thin slice of wealthy landlords and rich farmers. So, in order to boost demand, government expenditures were required to grow to put money in the hands of people in order to create a market for the goods produced. Now that's one role of the state in the dirigist regime. But because it is a capitalist regime, though with a strong state, it also has to fulfill its class role. That is, the state is, quote, the medium through which large-scale transfers were made to the capitalist and proto-capitalist groups. It was not, of course, the only instrument. Direct means such as eviction of tenants, private encroachment on common resources, and private encroachment on state-owned resources such as forests, from whose use the poor were simultaneously excluded, all played their role. But the state exchequer remained the preeminent mechanism of primary accumulation through the non-payment of taxes, to which the state generally turned a blind eye through a variety of subsidies and transfers, and through lucrative state contracts, private fortunes got built up at the expense of the state exchequer. Patnaik and Chandrasekhar point out that these two roles of the state in the dirigist regime, one as a medium to boost demand and two as a medium of transferring wealth to the capitalist class, are, quote, incompatible in the long run. As an example of this incompatibility, in a different paper, Patnaik points out that between 1965-66 and 1983-84, the total outlay of central and state governments together increased from just over 20% to 35% of gross national product. indicating growth in demand boosting expenditure of the government. On the other hand, the proportion of income and corporation tax gross at GNP factor cost came down from a minuscule 2.6% to 2.4% over the same period, highlighting the inability or unwillingness of the government to fund its expenditure through taxation. This systemic imbalance leads to a growing difference in what the government earns and what it spends. That is, it leads to an increase in the government's fiscal deficit. To make up the difference and deal with the fiscal deficit, the government has two choices. Either it slows down public investment, which in a dirigist regime means a slowdown of the economy, or it resorts to more borrowing to keep up the tempo of investment. We'll see how this plays out in a bit. On to the second contradiction. Patnaik and Chandrasekhar describe it as the inability of the state to impose a minimum measure of discipline and respect for law among the capitalists. This lack of discipline manifested itself not just in terms of tax evasion, but also in the manner through which the capitalist class in India used the state to enrich themselves at the cost of long-term and sustainable economic growth. Just to give one example, as we've already seen, the state had to keep borrowing to keep the economy going because the rich weren't keen on coughing up their fair share. Now, borrowing more to spend more has the effect of increasing the money supply in the economy, which causes the value of money to erode, as with any other commodity whose supply increases over time. Let's say you buy a pack of biscuits for 10 rupees, but if the value of money decreases, the next month you will have to spend more, say 15 rupees, to buy the same number of biscuits. This erosion of the value of money is called inflation. Now, inflation has the side effect of squeezing consumption, because if your wages aren't growing but everything costs more, then you don't have money to purchase the goods, or at least not as many goods as you did previously. That pack of biscuits costs 15 rupees now, but you still have 10 rupees to spend on it, so you end up not buying the biscuits at all. So while on the one hand the government is trying to boost demand through public spending, on the other, the manner in which it is financing the spending ultimately undermines it by reducing demand for mass consumption goods. You would imagine that the Indian capitalists would be rational enough to recognize the problem with this arrangement. After all, it is the market for products that they are making which is being squeezed. But no, that would require some restraint, some amount of discipline, which is certainly not forthcoming in the Indian capitalist class. Unlike other countries like Japan, where the state, which is also quite interventionist, works in close collaboration with industry and disciplines it to ensure viable economic growth. By the mid-80s, these two contradictions played out in a way that set the stage for the 1991 crisis. The Rajiv Gandhi government liberalized imports to a substantial degree in 1985, which led to an increase in the current account deficit, that is, the difference between the value of what we imported into India and what we exported to other countries surged. But Naik and Chandrasekhar also point out that this was happening at the same time that India's oil import bill, accounting for nearly a third of India's total import bill, came down in absolute terms between 85-86 and 88-89. At a time when remittance flows from non-resident Indians were flattening out and soft loans were becoming hard to get, there was a need to preserve foreign currency reserves. And import profligacy to service the demand for luxury goods like electronics and automobiles for well-off people was a significant barrier to preserving foreign exchange. Add to dwindling foreign reserves, burgeoning fiscal deficits, and escalating government debt to finance deficit through borrowing from abroad, and you have an economy that is vulnerable to inflationary upsurges and susceptible to crisis of confidence from international lenders and investors. The economy was on a powder keg, Patnaik and Chandrasekhar write, and while it is difficult to pinpoint exactly what was the spark that set the whole thing off, it was most likely a combination of the instability in the political system, the Gulf War oil shock, and rumors that a crisis was looming that eventually led to the crisis actually materializing.
Well, that's great. That's just fucking great, man. Now what the fuck are we supposed to do? We're some real pretty shit now, man.
And when it did, the third contradiction of the old regime came into play. And it has to do with the aspirations of the Indian bourgeoisie and elite sections to replicate the lifestyles of their counterparts in the developed countries. For this, they require more and more products that the bourgeoisie in the advanced countries consume, which the domestic economy simply isn't able to produce. Thus, over time, there was a growing pressure from this section for greater integration into the world market so that they may gain access to the products they desire. So, when the crisis hit, it was a great pretext to jettison the existing system and open up the economy for foreign capital to sell its products. That this would encroach on the market share of Indian capitalists was a legitimate concern, and a section of the Indian capitalist class had ambiguous attitude towards such liberalization. However, there was a section of this class that was willing to become a junior partner to foreign capital. And rounding out the liberalization lobby, Patnaik and Chandrasekhar Wright were a part of the top bureaucracy of the country that had either worked for or aspired to get a cushy job at the World Bank and IMF after retiring. All these elements, elite people with influence who occupied positions of power, used the crisis as an opportunity to push the economy onto the path which served and fulfilled their class interests. I want to share a couple of thoughts in conclusion. First, I have not spent a lot of time debunking or critiquing other theories about the reasons that precipitated the crisis. The sources mentioned below deal with some of them, so I encourage you to spend some time and go through them. Also, on the topic of sources, I know there's some of you who will complain that I've used biased sources because I'm relying on Marxist economists to make my point. And that is fine, I guess, if you think that I'm biased, because I guess I am. Here's the thing though. All the other explanations you may hear or read are equally biased and ideological. They just don't admit it and pretend that what they're talking about is as self-evident and unideological as the laws of physics, which they aren't. My objective is to tell you a different story than the one you may have heard and convince you of its logical soundness and its validity with regards to what actually happened. And I believe the story succeeds on that front. I believe it's quite legitimate. And I hope you don't dismiss it out of hand because it's biased and ideological, but engage with it and then make up your own mind. The final point I want to make is about sovereignty. When India gained independence from the British, our country had been ravaged and immiserated by 2 centuries of colonial rule under a capitalist world system that allowed the British to enrich themselves by plundering our resources, stealing our labor, and appropriating our riches wholesale. At the time of independence, the idea was to ensure that India would pursue a semi-autonomous trajectory of capitalist development. Even though the system was deeply flawed and undermined by the greed of the Indian capitalist class and the state's complicity in furthering that greed, at the very least we can say that we tried to engage with the world capitalist system on our own terms. What really changed in 1991 was that we gave that up. India, like so many other countries that attempted autonomous development, whether it was Allende's Chile or the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or Vietnam or countless others, has now been subordinated to the interests of foreign capital. And no matter what they say, foreign investors are not investing in India to bring employment or to end poverty and hunger. They are here to make a healthy return for their capital. That is it. And those two things, healthy return on investment and prosperity for the masses, don't often go hand in hand. And once you understand that, once you see that foreign investors are not benevolent angels that come bearing jobs and McDonald's burgers, once you start questioning whether the interests of foreign capital really do align with those of the working people of this country, once you do all that, you may start to notice a similarity between cheerleaders of the current system and collaborators during the colonial era who took issue with people vilifying the British and pointed out to all the jobs they had created building the railroads and telegraph lines. Absolute sovereignty actually never existed, of course, nor can it, in a world system where the big guys get to push the little guys around. And yes, it had always been eroding pretty much from the start, but whatever semblance of it was left, it was swept away in 1991. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is...
क्या है ये तूने दिल में था बंदा गुलाम आबदा, आओ हम गुलामी अपनी छोड़े, हो आजाद और रिहा। बदले ये सारी दुनिया बदले, जिसमें जोर जुल्म और जफा है। जंग हमारी आखिरी, जिस पर